Alright guys, so we're going to jump right into the subject here, and I'm going to explain to you guys why you want to replace these parts. These rod bearings, I got ACL rod bearings. I recently did 5 cylinders and I'm only missing one, so I can explain to you guys a little bit better with the bearing cap. So now these 2 last ones are brand new coated ACL racing bearings with the extra clearance. I got the extra clearance because my customer is going to drift the car, so I want an extra cushion of oil to protect from touching the crankshaft. The way the rod bearings work, I'm going to show you here. Let me get the new ones. So it's against the crankshaft, right? The crankshaft is in the middle, and however, there's no touch with the bearing and the crankshaft, so the crankshaft doesn't touch the bearing at all. There's an oil film in between the in between the crank and the rod bearing, right? And that's not supposed to touch at all. So now the difference between the ACL bearing, racing bearing, it's that they're coated, right? There's an extra coating here, and they're softer than the stock OEM bearings, meaning if your crank does happen to touch the bearings, they're not gonna get damaged as easy as those, meaning they're not gonna damage your crankshaft as as a stock OEM would, because it's softer. So it's made to save your engine pretty much. So if there's contact, it's not gonna get destroyed like an OEM would, right? And the clearance, right? The clearance is less than a human hair. It's very, very small. It's not gonna affect anything functioning inside your engine, but it's gonna give you extra oil film, right? It's gonna give you more oil in between the crank and the rod bearings, meaning you have more cushion and you have less chance of making those two touching, crankshaft and the rod bearings, which is good, right? One reason why you want to replace your rod bearings, I get it, there's no contact with the rod bearings and the crankshaft, so there's no wear, right? There shouldn't be any wear. But if you, depending how you drive the car, right, those bearings, it's stress. Like the rod is basically being pushed down and pulled at the same time, so up and down, up and down, up and down, and depending on how you're driving, this bearing is being pushed down, right? Because the rod is here goes the cap, right? So the piston is up here, so the piston is constantly pushing this rod bearing down against the crankshaft, and eventually the oil film is just not going to be enough, and is just gonna touch every once in a while, like barely touch. As you guys can see here, the coating came off almost completely on some of them, and those are the top ones, those are the bottom ones, and they look pretty much the same. So at the same time, one piston is being pushed down, another one's being pulled up, so it's constantly working up and down. This is the reason why you want to replace them, because you don't know if there was touch, if there was any attrict between the rod bearings and the crankshaft. And now that's reason number one, right? Reason number two, you want to have a peace of mind that you just did your rod bearings and that they're good enough. But now the meaning behind is not only wear, okay? It's not only the wear of the rod bearings, is the clamping force, because what holds these bearings in place is the clamping force, right? So we're gonna put the key here in place, right? And I explained this on another video that I did. The key is not what prevents the bearings from spinning, right? Because if you have a spun bearing, that's, your engine is going to go, because everything is going to overheat, since the bearing is not supposed to touch the crankshaft or is spin in the rod, right? Or the main caps. Usually happens with the rods, but if the rod bearing is spinning, it's going to spin once it's in contact with the rod, and it's going to spin so much, and there's no oil behind here. Remember, there's nothing to lubricate behind the rod bearing, so it's just gonna kill itself, right, if it spins. But now what holds it in place is not the key, is this force right here, right? This spring load that every bearing has. If you install a bearing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. As you can see here, right, I have to push this bearing down to snap it in place, right? I have to push it down, and that force is what holds it in place, along with torquing, once you torque against the rod, and the bearing, the other bearing is gonna push against this bearing, and it's just gonna expand in its home, right? And it's gonna hold it in place. I say that because some motors on other cars don't even have this key. This key is just to indicate the direction of the rod bearings, because they're directional. You can't put them facing the other way because the engine spins only one rotation, and BMW designed them to be put in one direction only. Other cars, doesn't really matter. You could put them, you know, if it doesn't have the key, it's not directional. Now I'm gonna show you guys the difference between the clamping force, right, of a used bearing. This used bearing has been sitting in the engine for so long. It's just been sitting there, right, and heat and beating on it for so long. This is the stock bearings. This was never replaced. Probably it was replaced under a recall because BMW had a recall on these cars, but that's back in, we're talking back in 2003, 2004, up to 2006, I guess. Not really sure. I wasn't at the dealer at the time, but here I'm gonna explain you guys. I'm gonna show you guys the stress that this bearing's been through, not only on wear, but on the clamping force as well. Look how little that is compared to a brand new bearing. So this is a brand new bearing. I'm gonna put it in the same location. Look how much more force it requires me to put this bearing in place versus the one that I just pulled out. A lot more. So now I'm gonna show you guys the used one again. It's really hard to look through the phone camera. Let me look over it. There we go. Look, it's like loose here. There's no force at all. So you see that there's no tension on this bearing anymore, meaning it could spin easier than a new bearing would, right? So you could have a spun bearing. Your bearing could be good, right? It could be still good here, no wear at all, but it doesn't mean it couldn't spin, because look at that clamping force. It's almost nothing compared to a new one. So this is the reason why I highly recommend you guys to replace. And now I'm going to talk about the ARP bolts. Right, the reason why you want to replace the ARP bolts, you want to use ARP bolts, is we're going back to saying, we're going back to what I was saying before with the rod being pushed against the crank, right? Pushing, and the bearing is in between the crank and the rod, so the rod's always pushing it down, and the bolts are holding it in place, right? They're holding the cap with the bearing together. One reason why, it's because it's, especially if you're racing the car, or if you're, you know, you have a supercharger, or you have a turbo, or you're running more power, the car's tuned, you're making more power, you're using the car for the track, you're not, you know, you're drifting, whatever it is, you're putting the car to stress. I recommend you guys to replace the ARP bolts, because the stock ones could stretch. The ARP bolts are made of a stronger material, and it's a lot stronger than the stock ones. And another reason why that I actually just did this today, after doing many ARP bolts and rod bearings, I actually just did this today, and it's very interesting. What I found is that the ARP is 1 gram. I use the food scale and I weigh them both, and the ARP bolt is actually 1 gram lighter than the stock one. So meaning you have 6 cylinders, you have 12 bolts, so that's 12 grams you saving on top of your crank. So that's a lot of force that you're saving, right? That's 2 grams per rod. So if it's heavier, think about it, if it's heavier, there's more weight on top of that rod bearing against the crank, and that could kill it much faster. So you want to replace and use the ARP bolt, even though you're not racing the car. If you're in there, if you open it up, just save yourself the labor and replace the ARP bolts. You're probably gonna spend an extra 200 bucks, but you're saving a lot, and there's a lot less stress being put on top of these rods, because it's not only 12 grams, it's not only 2 grams per rod. You got to multiply that weight when the engine is spinning, when there's, you know, motion. Think about an engine spinning over 8,000 RPM, which these motors are capable of doing, and they're designed to do. So you spinning this motor over 8,000 RPM, it's a lot. 2 grams is a lot on top of that rod, and smacking on that rod bearing. So that being said, replace your rod bearings, replace your rod bolts, and you're good to go. It's not only about the wear, it's about the clamping force that I mentioned, and the ARP bolts is not only about being stronger, but it's about being lighter and less stress on top of the new rod bearings that you're using. So this is it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you guys coming back to the channel and watching my videos. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.